Craig Fehrman. Welcome to the Inquiring Mind podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me.
It's actually I say this all the time because I'm very grateful to be doing this podcast, but I'm it's such a pleasure to have you on because I read your book that I have right here, Authors in Chief, which was phenomenal. And I actually didn't expect to like it this much. Um, I'm a avid reader of biographies and of nonfiction at large, and I thought, when you read an individual biography, you get drawn into the characters, but here they actually became lifelike, and I sometimes felt like I was reading fiction. On every page I was stopping and going, "Oh my God, I never knew that," and I think that might be the intention of your book,
Yeah,
but truly mind blown. I didn't uh, again expect to like it that much.
well, that's really kind of you to say. I knew that there was going to be a lot of fresh material in there, and that like my two favorite things as a writer are to find new things to tell people and new things to tell myself and learn. But then also, I still want it to be fun to read because sometimes you can get so focused on the research that you forget that the point here is to entertain. And so I tried to balance both those things, and it sounded like they worked in tandem for you. So that means a lot. Thank you.
Yeah. Obviously, I don't want to spend, nor do you want to listen to me toot your horn for an hour, but
I
uh,
mean, there are worse ways to spend a night, but sure.
yeah, but um, again, yeah, the book is phenomenal. I'd recommend it to everyone. But before we get into, the book and the everything you write in it, how did you first get interested in history and really fall in love with history?
That's a good question because people often ask me when did I start working on the book, but obviously your bigger picture question goes back a lot further. I guess for me, I can't really say when I fell in love with history so much as I can say when I fell in love with reading, because this is a book about presidents and the books they wrote. But I'm as much a books person as I am a presidents person. I hope there's new insights into different presidents we think we know, like Lincoln or Jefferson or JFK or Obama. But I also hope that my book is a love letter to books. And some of the best feedback I get is when people say, I loved your book, and then I immediately went out and tracked down Grant's memoirs because I wanted to read what this president that you've given us the behind the scenes look talked about. So that's, if you can write a book that gets other people to read more books and to love books more deeply, like that was always my goal, and that's what some of my favorite books do. So for me, I guess it started with just a love of reading, and it started out sort of in a kind of modern Lincoln kind of story where I lived in the middle of nowhere in Indiana, and we just took a lot of family trips to libraries, and my mom would let us each check out a milk crate's worth of books. It was a family of four. And so, I just always loved to read. I loved that books could take me to different places than the farm I grew up on and introduce me to different ideas and help me find out all kinds of different stories. And so it started there. And I went to grad school to be an English professor, and actually started out going to do Renaissance stuff like John Milton, Edmund Spenser, Shakespeare. And I still love that stuff. But when I was in grad school, I sort of drifted towards American literature. And then I started really liking to approach that through a historical lens because I was learning so much about the country that I lived in and still live in, of course. And so from then, it just felt like, that love of reading combined with that love of history. And so I guess it's hard for me to separate them, but to me, if you're going to write a book, you need to love books first. And so for me, it started as a little kid, reading the Hardy Boys and all kinds of other stuff.
It's funny you mentioned the Hardy Boys. My brother was obsessed with the Hardy Boys, and I remember one of my first book, I guess, memories was there was a bookshelf by we were in the same room, and there's a bookshelf, and there were like the first 10 Hardy Boys or something like that, and unfortunately I never got into them, but my brother really did, and uh, just a fond memory. And it's funny that you mentioned the Hardy Boys. Um, the other thing I realized about your book before, obviously, we get into it, um, it's not just your interest in history and your interest in reading, it's your interest in writing. When did you first realize that you wanted to be a writer?
It kind of developed in tandem with books and with loving books as a kid. I didn't have a really strong professional conception of this because, where I grew up, nobody I knew read the New Yorker or anything, honestly, even the New York Times. So that there wasn't, there was like our local county newspaper. That was like the journalism that I had heard of. And honestly, the stuff that I remember reading and being like, wow, it would be really cool to write this someday, was like PlayStation Magazine, because I'd play video games as a little kid and then get the magazines at Walmart that would like talk about, review the games and stuff like that. And so I really wanted to do journalism or grad school. I ended up drifting towards grad school, but I always had an interest in both, and just an interest in storytelling. There are a lot of pastors in my small town, preachers in my family, and I sometimes think that the job that a preacher does and the job that a historian does aren't that different, because both tell stories, both look for lessons in those stories, both try to entertain, but also try to instruct. And so, I kind of always had storytelling around me, whether it was books or whether it was, Sundays at church or whatever. But I didn't really know how to channel it professionally until I got into grad school. And there I started, interacting with people who wrote for the New Yorker and things like that, and started to see, well, hey, there's this whole professional way to approach it too. And so that it took a while to do that, but it all started, like I said earlier, with that love of reading and that love of books.
Yeah, the guest I had right before yours, this podcast, is an author named Edith Hall. She writes about Aristotelian ethics, and she had the similar like upbringing, but in England, where her father was a pastor. And sometimes I think that academics, and I pointed this out to her, academics have a tendency to write very well academic books. I mean, that's part of their job, but for me, the real way that you can convey that you're an expert in your field is when you can write a nonfiction book and make it read like a fiction book. And that's very difficult. I understand that, but at the same time, that's true mastery of your craft. And I think that could be traced to hearing pastors, and it's very accessible. I mean, sometimes you go to sermons that are very dry and long, but if you have a sermon that's very, short and to the point, gets the point across and is powerful, you go subconsciously, that's kind of how you want to write your book.
Right.
And so again, in your book, you talk about presidential writing, and how in some ways it was overlooked historically in many biographies. What can we learn from presidential writing, and what is the importance of conveying ideas in writing?
Sure. Well, I think there are a couple important lessons to learn, and what's interesting is that nobody had really pieced this together. There'd never been a book about presidents in the books they'd written before I wrote mine, and so kind of connecting those dots, I guess it makes sense why people overlook them, because if you look at most political books today, it's really easy to be cynical. Now, there are exceptions. Barack Obama is a great example. His presidential memoirs are obviously a book that he worked hard on, a very serious book, a book that historians will grapple with for a long time. But most political books, and frankly on both sides of the aisle, are just attempts to separate voters from their money, or to get those candidates on TV to talk about themselves. And so when the modern version of these books can be disappointing, it's easy to believe that every version of these books has been disappointing. I mean, frankly, that's kind of what I thought when I first started poking around this topic. But what I found, and why I think this is such an important topic and that so much can be learned, is that these books have actually been central to American history from the very beginning. I sort of talk about two traditions. I talk about campaign books, which are books that sort of help somebody get to the White House. And I talk about legacy books, which are books somebody writes after the White House. The first campaign book came from Thomas Jefferson, and the first legacy book came from John Adams, who, not many people know this, but he worked on a presidential memoir and wrote more than 400 pages before he gave up on it. So the history of presidents writing books is the history of America itself. We start with those two, and Washington actually had several requests to write an autobiography and decided that he wasn't fit to do it. But this goes back as far as America itself, and these books have often been at the center of really important elections. And it baffles me that we don't understand this more today. And I think it's just because we let the current version of the books distort the historical truths of the books. So even if you're a big history fan, You will learn things in my book about important elections, like the election of 1860 or the election of 1920 or the election of 1960, the elections where one of the most important parts of the election was a book written by a president that was a massive bestseller that conveyed ideas directly to voters and that really helped a candidate get to the White House. Probably my favorite example in the book is Abraham Lincoln, because there's no one who's been written about more in the English language than Abraham Lincoln, I don't think. But there's even the best biographies of him don't really delve into the fact that he wrote and published a book, and that it's not a book that somebody else did for him. He worked obsessively behind the scenes to make sure every detail, every comma was exactly how he wanted it to be. This book came out right before he ran for president, and it was a runaway bestseller. If you adjust the sales totals by population, because America was a much smaller country back then, it's the equivalent of selling 500,000 copies today. And really that number should feel even bigger, because books were very expensive in Lincoln's time and books were more shared. So selling a copy in his time, it was very likely that that book was shared among a family or even a community. So this book was vital to him running for and winning the White House. Newspapers at the time talked about it constantly. Mr. Lincoln's book. At first they called it Abram Lincoln's book because he was so new on the national political scene that they couldn't get his name right. But because of his ideas and because of the way they were conveyed in that book, they started getting his name right, and the book was essential to him winning the White House.
Also, do you see it at all concerning? Because a lot of these presidents also kept like personal journals and diaries and whatnot. I don't see that as a possibility these days with more contemporary politicians, because there's the risk of somebody stealing it, somebody leaking it, or somebody having to subpoena it in some situations, right? And are you concerned about the future of presidential writing?
I am. It's interesting that you mentioned that. One thing that I always wondered and expected to blow up, and I probably should have just written about this, but it never did, was that Obama talked in a couple early interviews when he started his White House term about keeping a journal to help him write a presidential memoir, which is something that lots of other people done. Lady Bird Johnson did it. Jimmy Carter did it. Bill Clinton did a version of it. And I thought, as soon as he said that, I was like, well, that's definitely going to get subpoenaed by Republicans in the White House or in Congress and become part of a big political debate, as Reagan's diaries did during the Iran Contra scandal. But nobody ever really brought it up or went with it, which really surprised me. And I mentioned Obama's example just to say that I'm not ready to go full narrative of decline here, because it's a little hard to say we'll never have literary presidents or something essential about writing has been lost when not that many presidents ago we had one of our most literary presidents ever. So sometimes it's sort of there are so few presidents that trends are really dictated by individuals. And so if we have another individual like Obama in the next couple presidents, well, then you could actually make the argument that literature is still essential to the White House and to American public life. That may not happen though, but either way, because of the legal and political strategies that you talk about and how anything committed to writing can become public, I definitely think there is less of a written record being produced than that there used to be. There are other examples of sort of pivot points like this in history, whether it's telephones or also leading to less of a written record. So things will definitely change and things will be different, and historians will have to adapt. But I remember when I was working on my book, getting to start working on the late 19th century, like post-Civil War, and working on, the chapters on Grant and the chapters on Roosevelt and Wilson, and just being like, man, there's just like, all of a sudden it's a problem of bounty. There's so many good details. There's so many good scenes, and I'm having to really choose what to include and what not, so I don't bog the book down too much. And I realized the reason for that was that we had their letters, we had autobiographies, which were now sort of like a widely accepted thing, being written by, Grant. 4 of the 5 main editors he worked with wrote their own autobiographies, including Mark Twain. So you could draw on all of that documentation. You could draw on the letters, you could draw on Grant's letters, you could draw on Grant's papers. So there were just so many sources. And that was just such a wonderful period to be able to write about historically. But even by, World War II, you start to see some of that stuff fading away. So there will definitely be changes. And I think it will be harder to work as a historian, but historians have to adapt, and we do have advantages. We have video now. It's, if you're wondering, you can find great pictures of Ulysses S. Grant, but you can't find any video of him. So as a historian, your job is to just sort of adapt and find new media and still bring a literary eye and a literary intelligence to those media.
To that point, I thought about that too when I was listening to you answer the question, and um, something about writing is different than video, right? In video, sometimes it could look staged. People are trained to look a certain way, speak a certain way, take certain pauses. It's practice, especially with politicians and presidents. What I realized in your book, and if you read any presidential biography, really, is that most presidential, when they write, it's very personal and they're very vulnerable, right? It's the one time they know nobody's gonna judge them for whatever they write because it's between them and the journal.
Right.
And I think if we set a precedent where presidents can't keep journals or are afraid to keep journals, we're going to lose a big part of what future biographers are going to base their research on.
Yeah, no, you're right. And it's never, you can't be someone that powerful without there being a little bit of artifice leaking in somewhere. Like even Jefferson and Adams, when they would write letters and when they would work on their autobiographies, they knew they would even, the way Jefferson organized and reorganized his papers as he got close to his death, he knew that Americans would pore over every single thing he had written and that he chose to save. And so that, that's in the back of their mind. But I still totally agree with you that the act of writing, it really just forces you to slow down. And what's cool about it is that it's a very democratic force. It's something we all identify with. Even if you're writing a Facebook post or a text message, translating what's in your head into text that someone else will then translate into something into their head causes everybody to slow down, causes everybody to think and reflect. It's a very human moment, and it's a very internal moment. Even if you're working with a ghostwriter and the ghostwriter asks questions and you have to review a manuscript, it's still causing you to slow down and be as precise as you can be about what you think, what you feel, what you're scared of, what you're trying to accomplish, what your goals are. And so there's something about writing that is, like you said, really intimate and really human. And that was one of my favorite things about working on this book, is that even presidents who, like a JFK, like a Lincoln, that are sort of statues at this point, it's very hard to humanize them or to see them as human beings. When you look at their writing, or when you look at the kind of behind the scenes stories about how their writing was produced, you can catch them in those human moments. And I think that's something that's really special about writing, and was one reason I was so excited to write a book about books.
Yeah, maybe starting from the most recent presidents going back, the story with Obama and his first book, Dreams from My Father. Yeah, from my father. Mm-hmm. Didn't sell that well. Wasn't a bestseller until I think he ran for president. Is that correct?
It was after, remember his big convention speech,
2004, yeah.
Which, you could argue that at that point he was basically running for president.
Yeah.
That speech, they were already working to bring it back in print, and once that speech blew up, they rushed it back into print, and it's been pretty much a bestseller ever since.
But the interesting thing about it, and you realize, same thing, and we're going to touch on JFK. Some things you can take away from how JFK treated profiles of courage and all of that. With Obama, the fact that he would campaign, right, and he would give away copies of his book to people, it's just so, that's an interesting thing. Like, I don't know if, for example, if, I don't know, a local politician, an unknown person, would start running in my local district and come up to me and it's like, this is why I should be mayor of New York City or whatever, and hand me their book. That's so unusual, but in some ways that's very, very personal, because it's not a pamphlet, it's not something cheap, it's something like they're giving you a book that they poured over. And with Obama, you could see that in spite of the fact that it didn't sell well, he valued it a lot, because he probably poured his heart out in that book.
Right.
Yeah,
I totally agree. And I still remember learning that detail. I was interviewing one of his old campaign aides. This was when he was a state senator, and the book had kind of come out, gotten really nice reviews, but hadn't sold very well. And so they were going to destroy all the old paperbacks because it just wasn't selling. And Obama managed to buy them from an independent bookstore, a Powell's in Chicago, which is a wonderful independent bookstore there. And so Obama bought them really cheap, I think like 50 cents a copy, something like that. And, they were just stacked in his office. But even when he would go on events, he would take a couple copies. And I think this really speaks to what you're saying. He didn't give them to everybody. he only gave them to the people he really connected with. But I think that's because the book for him was a very intimate story and a very personal story, and he wanted people to understand him. He's always been a politician motivated by a desire and a belief that mutual understanding can really change things. And so his, with Obama, it's almost a cliche, right? We think of Obama, we think of his books, and of course he's a literary president. But what amazed me in working on that chapter is that, even though that might be the first thing we think of, we still underrate how important the books were. Because the first book, not only did it not sell well, it was terribly difficult for him to write. He was years late. He lost a book contract. Only through the clever workings of a very good agent that he had at the time was he able to get a second book contract. And interestingly, the same agent the same publisher who ended up signing the second deal also had signed Donald Trump to Art of the Deal, a book that was very important in a different way to launching his political career. So same editor signed and launched both Obama and Trump, which is one of those ironies that in history that you just can't make up. But Obama's books mattered to him, and it sort of helped him figure out and make sense of his personal story, and sort of help him make peace with himself about, his family and how different the different branches of his family were, and how they could interrelate, and how their differences made him stronger and made him understand things that other people might not. And so figuring out how to tell his story in his book also sort of made him figure out how to tell a political story. And so I mentioned that speech that we all know in 2004, the convention speech, there's no red states, there's no blue states. You can find lines in that are directly echoed in his book and in his life story. And so working on that book, he didn't just figure out what his life story meant. He figured out how his life story could appeal to future voters, to future readers. And so working through that book was really, I think, the essential step towards him becoming a successful politician. And, the book didn't sell at the time, but once he really became a successful politician, the book was there and became a crucial part in him kind of sustaining his success.
Yeah. One of the interesting things I realized in Obama, I didn't read those two, I think the Audacity of
Audacity of Hope,
and Dream from My Father, but I did read his most recent, book, A Promised Land, which was quite good, and very long for the first volume, but very well written. But the difference you see in, say, his book and some of the campaign books that come out before every presidential campaign is that he wrote it, and it, and not just by the fact that it sold really well. I think that's just a testament to the fact that he's Barack Obama and he's a revered president by some, and but the fact that it was personal and he wrote it and it's his voice, and you can almost, even if you don't listen to the audiobook, you just read the book, you can hear his voice, you can hear Michelle. It's great. But then some of these books, I remember I worked in publishing for a very short amount of time, and I spoke to an editor, and I said, well, who actually reads these campaign books? Because most of them are not even written by the candidate. And she goes, it's less about who reads them. They don't even sell that well. It's more about, for the person that buys it, it's a way of supporting your candidate. And I was like, that's an interesting point of view, but still, it doesn't tell me your story. Right. And they obviously have their names on the front, and I have no problem with ghostwriting. It's as old as, book writing itself, but you notice it. Like I read when I was young, a few years ago, I read Our Revolution by Bernie Sanders, and I was like, it just doesn't, it feels like I'm listening to him on a campaign, and it's kind of boring, frankly. But then you get to, maybe My Life by Bill Clinton, or you get to Barack Obama's books, and you go, okay, this is good. And I think in some ways that can help their campaigns in the future, and just in general to kind of set the record straight. That's what they think they're doing. Ghostwriting brings me to a very interesting fact about John Kennedy that you write about in your book. And it's the story of him attending the National Book Award, and how badly he wanted to be considered as a writer. And Profiles of Courage, his book, was ghostwritten for the most part, correct? And still won a Pulitzer Prize. What does that tell you about his character, that he, accepted the Pulitzer Prize, and it mattered that much to him.
Right, and didn't just accept it, but as I was able to prove for the first time, really worked behind the scenes to get it for himself, and was kind of, sometimes seemed more interested in the politics of the Pulitzer than the politics of the country as a whole. This is a great example of what we were talking about earlier, where writing can be very personal, and sitting down to write, or in this case, sitting down to not write, can really show a human side of people. Kennedy's book is a pretty good nonfiction history book. It's a huge bestseller. When I talk to people at book events, in the pre-pandemic times, a lot of them had read it and remembered it fondly from their childhood. It does a good job. It's not, historians can and should quibble with it, but it's a fine work of trade history. And there's nothing wrong with the fact that it was mostly done by Ted Sorensen, his aide, and with a lot of help, not just from Sorensen, but a lot of history professors behind the scenes who chipped in and did research and edited passages and all kinds of other stuff. There's nothing wrong with that. The reason it became such a huge bestseller was because it had a very popular, very charismatic senator attached to it. That's how these things work, like we were just talking about. Sometimes the name attached to the book matters as much as the book itself. So it was a solid book, and it was a huge success because Kennedy was an interesting figure. All of that is fine. All of that is a story that has been echoed in many different points in American political history and American publishing history. The difference was that Kennedy really, really craved literary fame. And it starts even earlier than that. It starts, one of the stories that I tell in my book is before even they came up with the idea, and I say they, but really I have documents that show that Ted Sorensen was the one who came up with the idea for Profiles in Courage. But when they were sort of thinking, what's a book we can come up with that can help Senator Kennedy take the next step in his political evolution, Kennedy met with a Pulitzer Prize winning historian, and he would talk to her, and he told her, I think I'd rather win the Pulitzer than be president. There was just this real desire to have literary fame, even if when it actually came time to do the literary work, Kennedy would talk a great talk, but then rarely follow through and rely on the work of others. And so everything about the book was a big success. Let's set the Pulitzer Prize aside. In the year that the book came out, before the Pulitzer Prize was even announced, it had become a huge bestseller. It had become a huge political asset for him. It was something that, when he would get introduced on Meet the Press, he would be introduced as an author. He got to do lots of book events. What politician wouldn't like their name linked to the word courage again and again by mainstream journalists? And that's what was happening for Kennedy. So this was a book that had sold hundreds of thousands of copies, and Kennedy was very heavily involved in the marketing of his book. One of my favorite details I found in the archive was that Kennedy writing a letter to the editor saying, I think we should make the author photo a little bit bigger. But that helps the book sell, and that's an understandable desire, and probably a smart political one. So the book was a huge success in political terms, in sales terms. Kennedy should have been content, especially since he didn't do that much work on the book. And frankly, he couldn't have done that much work on the book because of the back surgeries he was having in that time.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Was there a large advance for the book? Did he get a lot of
No, it was the book shocked. It was published by Harper and Brothers, and they were shocked that it sold as well as it did too. Kennedy and Sorensen had worked on a magazine article about political courage, and when Sorensen sent Kennedy the first draft that Sorensen had written, he said, I think there might be a book in here, and I know an editor at Harper. Why don't you want me to run it by him? Do you want to run it by him? And so from there, Harper was interested, and they were of course very happy to be working with an up and coming politician, but nobody expected it to sell the way it did. So it was kind of shocking to everybody, and it was, it exceeded everyone's expectations. Kennedy didn't get a great advance for it, but it was, if I remember right, he used a lot of his advance to pay for some of the advertising and to help promote it at the beginning, because the goal for him was to have the book get his name out there, and get his name out there in this context of American history and great leaders and all that other stuff.
Which is pretty genius. And so
yeah, it was. I mean, it would be smart for any politician, but especially for him, somebody who was really good looking and on, glossy magazines, to also say, well, I have an intellectual side, I have a bookish side. And there's no question that he genuinely did care about books and like to talk to historians. That's very smart. He could offer you the 1-2 punch, the best of all worlds. And, Obama was somebody who was really charismatic too, but also had a very cerebral side. And you could get, you could appeal to more people in more ways. So Kennedy had all this working for him, and he had, every reason to be not just content and happy, but to be ecstatic that the book was doing this well. But he wanted more than that. He wanted literary fame. And so part of literary fame was going to the National Book Awards. And this is actually the story I tell at the beginning of my book, where Kennedy gave the keynote address at the National Book Awards, and Eudora Welty was there, Flannery O'Connor was there, Auden was there, and there are great pictures of Kennedy smiling and talking with them both, and getting to sort of be next to literary fame. But Kennedy wanted literary fame for himself, even though he wasn't able or didn't want to do literary work. And that's where you start to see behind the scenes, he put way more time into trying to get the book to sell well and to trying to get prizes for the book than he actually did into writing the book itself. I mean, I studied the schedules of Kennedy and Sorensen. I listened to old recordings. There's maybe 2 hours worth of dictated recordings that survived. I looked at all the drafts, compared dates on the drafts, compared handwriting, which is tricky to do because Sorensen and Kennedy's handwriting actually looks pretty similar. But I really spent a lot of time trying to see, well, maybe Kennedy had more to do with this than I thought. And I actually found an example in one of Kennedy's notebooks where his handwriting ended up being a few consecutive pages in the final book. So he did a little bit of work, but mostly he didn't, because he didn't have the time and he was dealing with surgeries. Where he got really involved was in the marketing push, and especially for the Pulitzer Prize. Remember, years earlier, he had talked to a Pulitzer Prize winning biographer and told her, I'd rather win the Pulitzer Prize than be president. And I guess he really meant it, because I found documents at the Kennedy Presidential Library where he was working behind the scenes with his father, Joseph Kennedy, to get the Pulitzer Prize for his book. And so they knew someone named Arthur Kroc, who was a very prominent journalist at the time, who was closely affiliated with the Pulitzers, and they sort of used Kroc to influence and talk to other people involved on the board. Kroc helped the book kind of move categories where it had a better chance. And in the end, the book did win the Pulitzer Prize, even though Kennedy didn't write the book. And what's so interesting is, if he had never gone for the Pulitzer Prize, I think this would be seen as one of the happier aspects of Kennedy's legacy. Because like I said, it was a good book. It was a huge hit. It was a political benefit for him. All the intrigue about ghostwriting and who actually wrote the book and is there a scandal here happened after the Pulitzer. There wasn't any, journalists loved Kennedy. There wasn't any journalists, they might gossip about it among themselves. And in fact, they did, man, I wonder how much the ghostwriter got of this best-selling book, because it's selling better than anyone thought. But nobody was trying to document in the media who really wrote this book until the Pulitzer Prize. So in a sense, Kennedy's desire for literary fame kind of came back to bite him, because once he took the step from best-selling book to best-selling Pulitzer Prize winning book, that's when the journalists started digging around. That's when the whiff of scandal started to come out. And that's when he, in a very Kennedy fashion, had to kind of ruthlessly squash these rumors and get people around him to cover for him, so this scandal didn't end up hurting his political reputation.
But in reality, does Kennedy actually have writing chops, or is he just...
He was a really good editor. That National Book Awards speech is, I think, a good example. That Ted Sorensen put it through a lot of drafts, but Kennedy he was good at cutting. He was good at swapping out a word choice. He was good at making things sound better and sound simpler. So he definitely had a good literary ear, and he was a great editor, and he was good at delivering the speeches as well. And also, he just cared about literary audiences and books, and that mattered, because his speechwriters could be doing lots of different things, but he wanted them to focus on this audience and to focus on burnishing this appeal. So you definitely have to give him credit in those realms. But in terms of sitting down and just pumping out page after page, there's just not very much evidence of that. One of the craziest examples of this, I think, is that when it came time to write the preface and the acknowledgments, Kennedy actually did write that. And then he had Sorensen edit it. And Sorensen had really good edits for him, because Kennedy had forgot to thank his wife. And Kennedy had also forgot to even mention Ted Sorensen. And so, Sorensen, in a note to Kennedy that I looked at the library, just wrote TCS, his initials, TCS ? So Kennedy ended up adding a sentence that was sort of like, I just want to thank Ted Sorensen for assembling the materials that this book was based on. Just the absolute bare minimum that you could give for a guy who actually wrote the book. But, that kind of stuff happens in political writing. Once this became a scandal, though, and remember, this entire scandal has been driven by Kennedy's literary ego, Sorensen didn't just swear under an affidavit that he didn't write the book. He and Kennedy pointed to that sentence as proof. They're like, look, yeah, Ted had a little work to do on the book, but we were honest about it. We mentioned it. It's not like we were trying to hide anything. When in reality, the only reason that sentence was there in the first place was because Sorensen had to remind Kennedy, shouldn't you at least mention me when I actually wrote the book? And that, those kinds of details are small. This is not the Cuban Missile Crisis. I fully admit that. But this is a very human moment, and a moment where Kennedy could have chosen to do it a couple different ways. And so I think the way he did choose to approach his literary fame tells us something about him as a human being.
Yeah, that's such a strange story. But can the Pulitzer Prize, can the Pulitzer, is it a committee? I don't know, but can the Pulitzer Committee take back the award, or they're never going to do it? But
Yeah, at this point, there's an award for Profiles in Courage that Pete Buttigieg won as a kid.
mhm.
It's too institutionalized at this point. But there, it starts out with subject experts who review the different fields like biography and history, and so they did not recommend Kennedy's book. It was only after the board, which is made up of more kind of public figures like the publisher of the Boston Herald and people affiliated with Columbia University, when those kinds of people got involved for the final round, then they were the ones who sort of, with the Kennedys offering their encouragement behind the scenes, they were the ones that elevated Profiles in Courage to that point, because it wasn't even a book based on original research. It was a book based on good work by other people. And it was a book where a lot of historians would read drafts and offer feedback and more suggestions behind the scenes. So it wasn't the kind of book that would typically even be considered for the Pulitzer. It was just that Kennedy really, really wanted a Pulitzer.
Yeah, and in some ways, yeah, one of the main reasons for your book is it's almost like myth busting, right? And um, in some ways, Kennedy got, his legacy is intact. Most people think, before your book, obviously, if they've read your book, they think differently, but most people think he wrote the book, he knows how to write, he's a good writer, he won a Pulitzer Prize, for God's sake. So like, the guy was the best of both worlds in some way, and the kind of the enigma of Kennedy is still kicking to this day. Were there people in your book that that maybe you liked before, presidents that you've liked before, but then you read a little bit about them or researched them, and you really realized that you maybe didn't like them as much as you thought, and the opposite too, where you liked somebody, but now you like them a lot more?
Sure. No, that's a good question. Um, One thing that I felt fortunate about is that I could sort of structure the book in a way to really spend time with the presidents who wrote really good books. If you were going to do this in a very strict and academic sense, James Buchanan would be one of the most important figures in the literary history of the presidency, because he was the first president to publish an autobiography in his lifetime. Lots of presidents had attempted it. I mentioned Adams writing that long autobiography, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe. 4 out of America's first 5 presidents tried to write their autobiography. And that's just such a startling fact, because British prime ministers weren't doing anything close to that in the same historical period. This desire to write autobiography and to write autobiographically is a very American desire, and the desire to read about our leaders too is also something that American readers have cared about from the very beginning. But they didn't publish those books because there was kind of a stigma where if you ran for president, or if you were a living ex-president and you published a book, that was seen as kind of vain and conceited, and you were supposed to be more of a humble person who was in the George Washington tradition, kind of called to serve. And so the first president to publish a book in his lifetime was James Buchanan, and the Civil War really kind of changed the ground rules, because it was a historical story that everyone was living through and knew was history at the time. And so everybody wanted to read what Jefferson Davis had to say about the Civil War and what Ulysses S. Grant had to say about the Civil War. And so Buchanan wanted to say, hey, the Civil War is not my fault, even though in many ways it was. And so he wrote a book, and it doesn't read like Obama's book. First of all, Buchanan wasn't a great writer. Second of all, there were kinds of literary forces at the time, so he wrote in the third person to still kind of try to preserve this idea that he was humble, and there were long quotes from his letters and primary documents. It's not a page turner at all. It's a pretty bad book by a pretty bad president. But that's what's nice about my approach, is that I didn't have to do 2 years worth of research and write a 50-page chapter about James Buchanan. If I was trying to do a strict academic history, I probably would have done that. But instead, I could just have a couple paragraphs about Buchanan, but then focus on the presidents that I really liked and enjoyed spending time with. Now, there were still presidents who exasperated me a little bit. I think John Adams is a great example of this. Adams is the thing about Adams is he can be your favorite president and your least favorite president sentence by sentence. And so I really love the chapter that I wrote about Adams. And I think he's very important because, you know, I mentioned that 4 out of the first 5 presidents had written autobiographies, but most of them were sort of like I talked about with Buchanan's book, a little bit stilted, a little bit formal. John Adams wrote an autobiography that is dishy. It could compare to Obama's memoir in terms of just really talking about personal and salacious details. And, you know, he talks about falling for Abigail and then goes on to say, hey, I want my kids to know they don't need to worry about any like half brothers or sisters out there because I stayed faithful. And so, you know, that would be a pretty crazy thing for any politician to say, but that was a really crazy thing for an autobiographer to say in the early 19th century. But the reason Adams was able to disclose that kind of stuff is that he just totally lacked self-control. He was just impulsive. He was angry. He would lash out. His feelings were easily hurt. And the solution to him was always to you know, offer more of himself and to write more and to say more and to argue more. And that's great. That's why he was able to reveal so much about himself in his autobiography. But that also can be a little bit tedious too. And, you know, I would never ask anyone to read all 440 pages of his autobiography. Just check out my book where you can get, you know, the summary and read some of the best examples, but not have to slog through the whole thing. So Adams would be an example of a president that I certainly admire, you know, his rhetoric during the Revolutionary period. His record as president's a little bit more mixed, but he was somebody who, as a writer and as a reader, sometimes I'd be like, "Oh man, this is great," and I think his chapter is one of the most fun chapters in the book. But there were also times where I was like, "Seriously, John? Like, you know how this sounds, right?" But I don't think he did, which is one of the reasons why he's such a fascinating figure. In terms of presidents that I really liked more than I expected, I think that the best example is Calvin Coolidge. We'll just keep it in New England. Coolidge was not somebody I had thought about a lot before working on this project. He's not, you know, on the top of anybody's minds in terms of presidential shortlists. The only thing people know about him is that he was kind of terse, right? Silent Cal. There are lots of good jokes and stories, some of them true, about him being very concise and very witty. But it turns out that being a writer was essential to his political rise and his political celebrity. The New York Times found or ran a story while he was president and called him the most literary occupant of the White House since Lincoln. And I looked through Coolidge's papers and found where he read that article and wrote a really cool letter back to the journalist just saying that how much that meant to him, because Coolidge had always really cared about his writing. He worked hard on his speeches even when he was a state senator in Massachusetts, and those speeches really helped elevate him onto the national stage and ultimately become president. And then he wrote an autobiography that honestly is right up there with Grant's in terms of the best legacy books written by a president. It's so concise, it's so personal, it's funny, it's self-deprecating. It doesn't really get into the political back and forths that so many presidential memoirs do. It just sort of says, what did it feel like to be president? And Coolidge captures that better than anyone because he was such a great writer. And I didn't know any of that going in. So the fact that I have almost 2 chapters on Calvin Coolidge, I think is surprising and perhaps not a selling point on its surface for the book, but I hope when readers finish it, they'll see that Coolidge was actually way more interesting as a writer and a thinker than we may give him credit.
Maybe to take it back a little bit and something we talked about a little bit, we touched on earlier in the conversation. I never, before you mentioned it, never thought of The Art of the Deal as launching Donald Trump's political career, because if I'm not mistaken, it was published in the 90s.
87, I think.
87, there we go. And yes, he does reference it, and I think a lot of people know him for The Art of the Deal because he is Mr. Art of the Deal. Mm-hmm. And he played to that in many ways. But do you see that book as very seminal to his to him being elected, or is that just like just a thing in his on his resume?
No, your reaction is totally fair, and like I said, I think one reason I was able to sort of uncover this kind of secret history of American politics is because most of us dismiss these books out of hand because we've seen some of the other books you mentioned that are just not that good. You can tell that sort of a speechwriter is involved, and that's about it. And so I totally get that dismissive approach. But if you go back and look at that Art of the Deal, and its impact. It was really, before he had the Twitter feed, even before he had the reality TV show, it was what turned him from being a New York City figure into a national figure. And it wasn't just the book itself. I mean, I think I don't know if it's right to call it an entertaining book to read, because whatever your views on Trump today will be reflected in it, and that, his outlook, his demeanor, his rhetoric, it's all right there in the book. So it's a book that captures him as a person very carefully. So however you feel about him today will definitely manifest in the way that you read the book. And the reason it's such a revealing book, I think, is because he didn't necessarily work hard himself on it, but he picked a really good ghostwriter, and he gave that ghostwriter lots of access. And so I think we have to give Trump credit for that, in that, no, he didn't sweat every sentence the way Obama did, but he still took the book seriously and allowed really good professionals lots of access to him. And this ghostwriter would actually spend time on the phone. The other person Trump was talking to didn't know this, but he would just sort of silently lurk on the phone and sort of listen to Trump talk, make deals. And that was how he was able to absorb Trump's voice and capture and reproduce Trump's voice on the page. But anyway, this book, I don't think it's not just revealing about who Trump was and is as a person and a political thinker. It played a huge part in his celebrity. And several times in my book, I sort of try to connect what's happening in politics to what's happening in literature or what's happening in Hollywood, because I think those contexts are too often overlooked by biographers. And they're really good at, the Cuban Missile Crisis or those kinds of political blow-by-blows. And that stuff's important. But I don't really get into the politics in my book. I don't talk a lot about Calvin Coolidge's policies. I talk about how Calvin Coolidge was able to use his image as a farmer very savvily, while also being the first real radio star of a president, and how he was able to synthesize those. And so I think those kinds of contexts really matter. And for Trump, what was happening when his book came out was that publishing was changing, and publishing was getting really obsessed with these huge blockbuster books. The reason Trump even got a book deal was that Lee Iacocca, the general manager, a CEO of a car company in America, had a huge best-selling book that nobody expected. And so now every editor in America is looking for books by business people, because this is a hot new category that's selling millions of copies. And so an editor went to Trump and just tried to recruit him, basically, and said, hey, do you have a story you want to tell? And all of a sudden, this blockbuster book is everywhere. And by everywhere, I mean it's in Walden Books, which is a new book chain that's showing up in malls all across America. And it's on the Phil Donahue show, because cable TV is expanding and is desperate to fill airtime. And so authors like Trump are able to go again and again, and they have a book, and that gives them an excuse to go on there. But what Trump is really talking about and promoting is Trump himself. And so the book, because he was able to take advantage of these new national chains, and I actually have a picture in my book that I think is really interesting of Trump doing a book signing for his second book that came out next at a Walden Books. And you can just see how much these new retail channels and new media channels like cable TV mattered. The book gave Trump the leverage to sort of become a national figure. And so without that book at that moment in 1980s, when publishing was going through some huge changes, I don't think he would have become the national figure, and I don't think he would have, been on anybody's radar for a future reality TV hosting gig or a long shot presidential candidacy.
Yeah, one of the similarities I noticed in the book, I'm sure somebody else brought this up before, but reading the part about Andrew Jackson reminded me a little bit of Trump,
Mm-hmm.
not in the war hero type of way, because Trump is not a war hero,
yeah, right.
But the way they gave access to their book.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Jackson has a crazy story with 3 dead writers, ghostwriters that you can elaborate on, because that's one of the most bizarre stories out there.
Right.
But I just saw a lot of similarities between, even demeanor wise, between Donald Trump and Andrew Jackson. Do you see it the same way?
I totally agree with you. And what's interesting is that they were both really good at manipulating and leveraging the popular media of their time. Because for most of the history that I covered in my book, books were popular culture. Like, books were what people did when they needed something to do at night, or when they wanted to know what was happening in the world. And that's obviously still true of some of us, like you and me today, but that's not true of all Americans necessarily anymore. But for long stretches of American history, books were news. Books were where interesting things happened and were happening. And so Jackson was, he had this image, mostly deserved, of being kind of a frontier rascal, but he was very smart about using literary fame behind the scenes. And his desire wasn't Kennedy's desire. Andrew Jackson didn't care at all about people thinking he was literary. He never got credit for any of it. Somebody else wrote the book about him. But the book that they wrote with Jackson's coaching, and also Jackson did work to kind of help the book sell, sort of captured his personality and digested his personality. It's not just that they gave his record as a war hero. They told little memorable stories about him as a general and even as a young man fighting with the British in the Revolutionary War. And those little stories, even in the 19th century, were made to travel. All of a sudden, it's not, here's Andrew Jackson's views on Native Americans and how he wants to persecute them. It's just, hey, Andrew Jackson stood up to the British when he was, 13 years old, and he still has the scar to prove it. And that kind of simplification and that kind of symbolism really took off in those elections in 1824 and 1828 because voting was switching from being a very elite practice that only landowners, male landowners, could participate in, to something that was more widely shared. And obviously, it still had a long way to go in terms of everyone in America having the opportunity to vote. But once it started to become more democratic, then politics became a little more shallow. And Jackson was really smart about that, and really smart about using a book to do that. And he controlled and cared about the smallest details. I actually found letters from Andrew Jackson that no Jackson biographer has ever seen. I still remember calling the editors at the Andrew Jackson papers at the University of Tennessee, which are like these big multi-volume editions of everything he's ever written. And I was like, guys, I almost hate to tell you this, but I think these are Jackson letters I found in this archive, and you guys don't have them. Am I crazy? And they're like, oh man, because they've already printed. They're always working to try to capture and add things out of order, the kind of newest stuff that trickles in. But in those letters, Jackson was focused on, how do I recruit the best traveling salesman to sell my book? And that's a lot different than Walden Books and malls. But it's not really that different. It's just a different time period. It was the cutting edge way to get your ideas out there and into the hands of voters and readers. And whether it was Andrew Jackson recruiting traveling booksellers, or whether it was Donald Trump going to Walden Books and signing copies for people, in both cases, you could see people using the machinery that was available to them to really elevate their political ideas and their political careers. And I just found story after story of that, where people would use books as a way to define themselves and to get themselves out there, because books have always been important.
Right. And to that point, I think uniquely in America, we yearn to learn more about presidents and what they did on a day-to-day basis. Again, why the Promised Land sold so much, and Bill Clinton's, and why they get these $1 million advances, and $40 million or whatever it was for Obama, right. Which is bizarre to me to hear about a book advance. But
the publisher's going to make a lot of money off that. They should have paid more. Somebody else should have come in and offered $60 million, because it's going to make everybody a lot of money.
I think it already kind of did. I think it.
Well, Michelle's book, yeah,
Michelle's book and Barack Obama's book as well. The truly incredible story. And I don't know how you found this, and I'm fascinated to learn how you did, as a book nerd, as a person that likes publishing and is interested in the inner mechanisms of publishing. The story of Henry Carey, right? Sure. So to me, Henry Carey was like the first contemporary book publisher, similar to like publishing houses now, where he thought of the idea of giving people an advance instead of like a subscription service to books. And in exchange for that, he signed, I think, Washington Irving, James Fenimore Cooper, all of these great fiction writers, because he wanted to show the world that Americans have a voice and they have something to say. How did you uncover that story? Where did you find it? Because I've been interested about books, and I'm almost jealous I didn't find it, or somebody,
Sure. Yeah, well, it's that's some of my favorite stuff in the book too, and I hope that that's what really makes my book feel like a real story. Like, yeah, we're bouncing from Adams to Jackson and sort of moving around with different presidents, but this was a real story where nobody had really connected the dots before. And so even like Henry Carey's dad, Matthew Carey, was a very important publisher. He was somebody who Jefferson would go to when Jefferson needed books. He was somebody who employed Parson Weems, who was this famous traveling bookseller who ended up writing the cherry tree story about George Washington. And, I quote a letter when Parson Weems was like, "I'm trying to sell the John Adams books, but they're so bad and nobody wants them." And so, from going to Matthew Carey to Henry Carey to Parson Weems and connecting them to, Matthew Carey was the one who published the Andrew Jackson book that we've talked about so much. Those connections, I think, show that this is a real American story that's always been there. It's just that biographers and historians haven't always taken the time to look. But it's, you can't understand, you can't just summarize what's in Profiles in Courage or what's in Dreams from My Father and be like, these are the ideas, that's the end of the story. Because that's not how history works. Like, it doesn't matter what ideas are in a book if nobody reads the book. And so you need to know, well, how do people care about the books? How do people literally access and buy the books? How much does a book cost? And so I tried really hard to answer those kinds of questions at every point in American history, and then to try to illustrate them through stories like Henry Carey. And, he was somebody who had this entrepreneurial spirit, and he would go with his dad to work, and the other booksellers would call him a bookseller in miniature, because even as a little kid, he kind of had this knack and understood that for America's international reputation to really take off, one thing it needed was great American writers. And those great writers were people like Irving and Cooper, but they needed American publishers to take a chance on them in the first place. And Henry Carey was essential to doing that. So in terms of where I found that kind of stuff, I've got to give a lot of credit to academics. There's this whole field of academic research called book history, or history of the book. And you have English professors who work in it. You have history professors who work in it. And their stuff is great. It's not always presented to a broad audience because it's still a pretty new academic field, and so it's still being sorted out, and they're still working with each other and collaborating and refining and kind of figuring out the main story themselves. So I can't tell you, like, here's one great volume that will tell you the history of publishing in America. Like, that volume doesn't exist. There are good volumes from like the 1940s and the 1960s that sort of tell that story, but they're way out of print. And so I think that one thing Author in Chief does is it kind of tells you along the way, this is the history of American publishing and American books and American readers. But there's a great book on Henry Carey and his partner, business partner, that came out, I think, in the 1950s. It's been out of print for a long time, but the research library at Indiana University, where I did a lot of my work, had a copy of it. And so I read that book, found some good stuff in there. Also did some work in Matthew Carey's archives, which are preserved in Philadelphia at a historical center up there. And so I would often do my own research because, there have been really good books written about Matthew Carey and Henry Carey. And when the authors, the professors who wrote those were still alive, I would call them on the phone or interview them to try to get more information from them. But they were focused, because book history is itself still pretty new, they were focused on, like, well, what are the connections to Washington and Irving, which makes sense. Like, that's what they should focus on. But they weren't like, what are the connections to Andrew Jackson? And so that's when I could go into the archives and then sort of look, well, what are the political or presidential connections here? And so a lot of relying on really good academic research that other people had done, but then also taking the time to read all of that, but also go and do my own work in the archives, was how I was able to find these details and these nuggets, and hopefully remind people that, at the same time that Andrew Jackson is trying to redefine American politics, James Fenimore Cooper is trying to redefine American literature. And John Quincy Adams is writing in his diaries about how, if I could do it all over again, I think I would have rather been a poet, because America really needs a poet to stand up on the international stage, an idea that Thomas Jefferson had written about in his book a generation before. So, trying to connect those dots is something that I hope makes my book feel like a real story, because I think it is a story, and you can't tell the political aspects without also telling the literary aspects and the personal aspects.
Is the Carey bookstore still a thing, or is it a historical site? Do you know? I've been to Philly. I just didn't know about the Careys before I went to Philly.
Yeah, no, I included a woodcut in there of the bookstore and what it looked like, because it started out, his dad had a very small bookstore, and bookstores at that time didn't sell a lot of books because books were very expensive, and most of the people who bought books were very wealthy, like Thomas Jefferson. So they sold a lot of quill pens and paper, which, you talk about interesting echoes. What does Barnes and Noble have as much of as books now? It's stationery and other stuff, because books aren't always the way that they can turn a profit. So those sorts of ideas have been there since the beginning of the American book trade. But Matthew Carey started out with that really small store, and then by the time Henry Carey really has things up and running, they have a 4-story brick building, and it's no longer standing. I remember looking it up even on Google Maps to think, well, is this building still standing? Would it be worth driving there to kind of be able to describe it better? But unfortunately, it's now gone. But yeah, they're fascinating figures, and they played an important part in American history. Andrew Jackson's book wouldn't have been as big a hit without Matthew Carey's publishing savvy behind the scenes, and without Andrew Jackson's savvy. Andrew Jackson knew Matthew Carey is the guy I need to reach out to because he's the best publisher in America. And so all those people working together behind the scenes played important roles in Jackson's political rise.
Yeah, it's unfortunate that I can't go visit the Carey bookstore.
Yeah, you can see the house where well, it's not even the original, but it's a replication of the house where Jefferson wrote the Declaration. That's about the best you can do in Philadelphia in terms of those kinds of literary landmarks.
So what are the biggest differences that you noticed while writing the book between contemporary political books and the ones in the past? Is it the quality of the writing? Is it because oftentimes when you read for example, if you read David McCullough's John Adams, right, you notice the fact that the writing was so exceptional by pretty much every character, and these letters could be books, and you're envious reading it because you go, I wish I could write that well. But
right.
What are some of the biggest differences that you noticed?
Sure. Well, again, I don't ever want to be like everybody was a great writer back then and nobody is a good writer now. It's always more complicated than that, because we have somebody like Obama who's a very literary politician, and also David McCullough is an excellent quoter. That's an important skill for any historian to have. So John Adams wrote amazing letters to Abigail Adams, but he also wrote letters to her that were like, do we have enough food at home? I'll be home in a couple weeks. Should I pick up some food in Boston? So, as a good historian, you've got to choose the good stuff. And the nice thing is there's so much stuff from this time period, and even more in the generations that came after it, that you have a lot of good things to choose from. But there's no question that the written word mattered more, and that people read more, and that, the way to win a political debate at that time wasn't to go on TV and have the best 30-second clip. It was to write the best pamphlet. And so there were incentives for people to write the best that they could, and to produce really good writing. Now, that doesn't mean that people didn't write bad political books. I mentioned Mason Weems, the traveling bookseller, and he literally could not sell the John Adams books because they were so boring. And John Adams liked to write letters where he was like, my books have never gotten enough credit. Pretty much, the Constitutional Convention turned because my books came on a ship from Europe when they were finally published. And that's just not even close to being true. I admire John Adams's conviction and belief in himself, but he's wrong about that. His books are just not, they're interesting in terms of insight to him, but they were not influential books, and they got really bad reviews. And Adams would stay up late at night feeling angry and trying to think which one of his enemies had been behind the scenes trying to get this bad review published, when in reality it was just a bad book that got the review it deserved. So there have been bad books in the past, and there have been good books today. But I would say that the biggest difference is there's a good difference about today, and there's a disappointing difference. The good difference is just that books are more accessible. And it's like, we really can't overstate how rare and hard it was to get books. Books are a physical thing. Books are heavy. Books take up space. And books, like any other commercial good, the more you make of them, the cheaper they are. So at the early in American history, there aren't that many readers. There aren't that many people who can afford books. The way type is set by hand itself makes books a very laborious thing to produce. And then if you live in the middle of the country on the frontier, let's say in Indiana, like a Lincoln, and you want a book, well, it's going to have to travel in somebody's saddlebag or in somebody's wagon to get to you. That's expensive. They could put gunpowder in there. They could put sugar in there. They could put things that people actually need to stay alive in there. And you want them to bring a book? And so because of those reasons, it was very difficult to get books around. And so, you would borrow books, you would borrow old books, you would be thankful for any book that you could have. Whereas today, thanks to, the renaissance in independent bookstores, thanks to, online retailers, if I want a book, whether it's a brand new book that everybody wants, or whether it's an old book that's been out of print for a long time, I just get the book. And it's sometimes easy to forget that that's kind of an act of magic. That didn't, for most of American history, for most of the history of reading, that was not the case. And so in a sense, it's never been a better time to be a reader, because it's easier to get books. And that's not even factoring in, public libraries, which do so much important work. And, presidents like Ronald Reagan, like Harry Truman, people who couldn't afford books even in the 20th century because of their family circumstances, they relied on their public libraries to really shape them as readers. So that's a positive about today. It's never been easier to find a book. It's never been easier to find the book you want. That's great. The downside is, I think, what you've sort of hinted at, that sometimes the books aren't as good as they should be. And, sometimes the books are just an avenue for easy money, or a approach to try to get on TV. And I guess that's the contradiction that really frustrates me. American readers have always wanted to know about presidents, about politicians, about ideas. That interest was there way back when Mason Weems was creating the cherry tree story, and that interest is still there today. And now they can actually get these books. They can afford the books, they can order the books. The problem is that the quality of the books has dropped a little bit, and certainly there are some real duds. And so I wish American politicians would take the time to really produce good books, because the audience is there, the distribution is there, the media coverage is there. And if they would put together, not everybody can write literary classics, but if they would put together competent literary books that told their life stories and conveyed their political ideas, I think it would work out great for them. And I know it would work out great for readers.
Yeah. To begin, maybe wrapping up this podcast, I asked two questions at the end of every podcast, regardless of the guest. First one is, what gives you hope for the future, and for the future of this country and whatnot? And the second question, and you can feel free to answer it in any order you want. What are 5 books or more that you would recommend to anyone on any topic, whether it be fiction or nonfiction?
Sure. What gives me hope, I guess, is in the answer I just gave, the reader part of it. It's true that we don't read as much as we used to. I mean, there's no way around it. That's just true. But it's also true that a lot of people still read, and that a lot of people still care about books. And that if you produce a really good book, a book that doesn't say, well, everybody's just going to watch TV anyway, but a book that says, what if I try to make something that's more entertaining than TV, that's better than TV, that people are like, I don't care about TV, I just care about this book. You can try to do that. And readers still care about that stuff. And readers still care about really serious books. In my book, I talk about America as a nation of nonfiction. And, these campaign books, they started as an American innovation with people like Andrew Jackson. Legacy books, obviously there have been political memoirs back to the Greeks, the Romans, and even earlier than that. But still, they really took off in America, and they were more popular in America than anywhere else. And that's still true today. So there's this real hunger for Americans to sort of learn about ideas, to learn about who they're voting for, to learn about who they voted for, to understand and articulate the kind of key debates that have defined America all along. And so that gives me hope that desire and that impulse is still there. It's just kind of on the politicians, but also the biographers and the historians and the novelists to rise to meet it. And so, the fact that people still do read, even though there are so many distractions and so many other options. And remember, I'm the guy who wanted to be a writer because of his PlayStation and PlayStation Magazine. So I'm not knocking all of those distractions. Some of them are great. But I still care the most about books, because I think books offer the most back to you. Books aren't trying to make money off you or trying to take something from you. Books are nutritious. Books have value. Books have worth if they're done well. And if they're done well, there's still an audience for them. So that's what gives me hope. In terms of books people should read, I'll throw out a couple of presidential ones, and then I'll throw out a couple just like books that are fun to read. I should also, I guess, say that I put out an anthology since Author-in-Chief came out called Best Presidential Writing. Nice. And so if you want, some of the books I will mention are in there, like the John Adams. I mentioned that John Adams could be a very bad writer while also being a very good writer. Well, that's only the good stuff in there. The fun stuff from John Adams' autobiography, you can read the 13 pages and not worry about the other 387 pages. that I read, so you don't have to. So that might be a place to get a sampling for it. But if you don't want to do that, some of these are available, and I actually have links and information in the back of Author in Chief. Calvin Coolidge's autobiography, I think, is really worth reading, just because it's a short book, it's an entertaining book, and it really, like I said, captures the personal side of the White House. And it's, if you've read Obama's book recently, which is much more in the tradition of presidential legacy books, and kind of, sort of walks through what he was thinking in every big decision, and who he was arguing with, Coolidge's book is a really interesting counterpoint and kind of a different vision of what political memoir could be like. So that would be the first thing that I would recommend. The second one I would recommend would be Grant's Memoirs, which everybody says is the best presidential book, and it's a great book, but it's an even better book when you understand the story behind the scenes and the kind of personal financial stuff he was dealing with, the cancer he was going through. I mean, it's just like, one of the details from my research that still sticks with me is that as Grant was trying to finish his book, he was so gaunt from the cancer that was killing him that he had to take off his wedding ring, because it wouldn't stay on his hand. But he still kept writing because he really wanted to finish the book and get his version of the Civil War down. It's not a book that really talks about his political career. It talks about his military career.
And also the story is that he didn't want to leave his wife destitute, because he lost pretty much all his money right before. He was pretty bad at investing. But sorry, carry on.
No, you're totally right. And his wife is a wonderful character, wrote him great letters, was his number one reader, wrote a really interesting autobiography herself that I don't really talk about in Author in Chief, but it's, if you can track it down, a used copy of it, or at a research library, it's really good too. So Grant's Memoirs is a really good example. Another book I'll throw out there is a book by a reporter named Lillian Ross, and the book is just called Reporting. And she's been dead for a little while now, and she wrote most of her great stuff in the New Yorker in the 1950s, 1960s. But she would write profiles of people, or just stories about regular people. She wrote a very famous profile of Hemingway in old age. But you were talking about the best nonfiction reads like fiction, and she's a great example of that. When you read her nonfiction, you're not going to find paragraphs of exposition where she's like, these are the big ideas I'm writing about, and these are the statistics that support those ideas, but people on the other side might say this. Like, she doesn't care about that. She cares about people, and she cares about their ideas and the way they think about ideas more than the ideas themselves. And so she's probably my favorite nonfiction writer, and that book is hard to find, although there are other collections, but you just can't go wrong with her. I'm always pushing her on people. If you want somebody who just can show you the best of nonfiction, Lillian Ross is a great example, and her book Reporting is a great example of that. In terms of fiction, the best novel I read this year was by somebody named Patricia Lockwood, and it's I think it's called No One Is Talking About This. But even if you just search Patricia Lockwood novel, you'll find it. But I think it's called No One Is Talking About This, and it's interesting because several of your questions and a lot of our conversation is circled around, do people still read today? How has the internet changed things? Is the internet good or bad? And Lockwood is a writer's writer. She's wonderfully literary, has read way more than I ever had, has great opinions about literary history, but is also extremely online. Like, she's one of the funniest people on Twitter you'll ever find. And I don't want to spoil her book, but I think it's a really interesting book to read about, and then sort of think about, well, what is life like today? How has the internet changed things? Is it good? Is it bad? Spoiler alert, it's bad for sure. And so it's a book that really gets into that stuff, but also the second half of the book is like, it's totally unlike what you'll expect. It's a book that I sobbed while I read. It's so moving. It's so perfectly done. It's just a wonderful novel, and it's a novel that will cause you to think about big picture stuff, but it will also cause you to be moved on the tiniest human level. That I really can't say enough good stuff about that. The last book I will probably recommend is a book that sort of it is a little more idea driven than Lillian Ross's, but still has great nonfiction touches and still has characters and human beings that you care about. And that's The Metaphysical Club by Louis Menand. He's got a new book out that I have not read yet about the Cold War that seems to be getting some good early buzz. But it's hard for me to imagine that's going to be better than The Metaphysical Club, because that is one of the best works of American nonfiction in the last 50 or 60 years. And so remember when I talked about how the kind of late 19th century, early 20th century was like the golden period for writers, because there were letters, but there were also autobiographies, but there were also great journalism and profiles in magazines at the time. Like there's just so much great text being produced in this period that it's a gift for anybody who's going to write about that. Well, nobody is more gifted than Menand, and he was able to sift all that and tell this really interesting story about pragmatism. It's, it's a book that Obama has read, and you will certainly hear echoes of Obama's political philosophy when you're reading The Metaphysical Club. But it's also just sort of about like, how did this American idea come to be in the post-Civil War area? And it's also just a really interesting study of thinkers as people and kind of their personal lives. So let me see if I can remember these. Coolidge's memoir, which is short and personal. Grant's memoir, which is long but authoritative. Lillian Ross's reporting, which is just like a great example of nonfiction reporting and how to portray other people. Patricia Lockwood's new novel, which is just about what it feels like to be alive right now. And then Menand's Metaphysical Club, which is just like the best history of ideas that I can think of. So those are 5 books that mean a lot to me, and I would urge anybody to give them a shot.
Great. Again, thank you very much for coming onto the podcast. I highly recommend, the same way you just recommended 5 books that will be linked on the bottom of my, Spotify, Apple Pod, everywhere. Obviously, I will walk around recommending your book because it was truly great and very pleasurable to read. So thank you for writing it, first and foremost.
Really
Thank you.
Say that, man. I appreciate that, and this conversation's been the highlight of my week. So thanks for the great questions and the great insights you contributed to. It's just fun to talk about books, right? It's
for sure. Thank you. Hope to speak to you again in the future.
For sure. Have a good night, and thanks again.
You too.